What if the most terrifying ruler in ancient history was not a warlord or a conqueror, but a queen whose power came from practices so ruthless that even her allies whispered her name in fear? Before you dismiss that as legend, consider this. Every empire has produced tyrants, but only one woman left behind stories so disturbing that entire generations tried to erase them. And the question that still haunts historians is simple. How did a queen rise to a level of absolute domination where cruelty became her language and terror her most loyal servant? To understand that transformation, we need to step inside a world where loyalty was bought with blood, where symbols carried the weight of death, and where a single mistake could unravel the fragile illusion of control she fought to maintain. Imagine the palace corridors at night, lit by trembling fire that casts shadows longer than truth itself. Here, every rumor carried a pulse. Every whisper could lead to disappearance, and every servant knew that survival meant studying her moods more closely than the stars. But the deeper question is not about what she did to others. It is about what forged her. No one becomes the most ruthless queen who ever lived by accident. Something shapes that hunger, sharpens it, feeds it until it becomes a weapon. And the clues lie buried in fragments of her early life, scattered like broken pottery unearthed centuries later. A stolen throne, a childhood marked by betrayal, advisors who used her as a pawn before realizing she was learning their every tactic. These shadows did not merely surround her, they built her. But here is where the story bends. Many rulers used violence. Fewer used fear. Almost none understood how to turn fear into a system. She did. And the first step in that transformation was not a public execution or a secret ritual. It was a question she asked herself every morning before sunrise, a question historians rarely address. What must I become to ensure no one ever holds power over me again? That question shaped her decisions, her alliances, her punishments, and even her darkest practices. And once she found the answer, there was no turning back. Every kingdom around her underestimated the force she was becoming. They saw a young queen, vulnerable, surrounded by men waiting to manipulate her. What they failed to see was the storm gathering behind her silence. Her cruelty was not impulsive. It was calculated, strategic, almost ceremonial. The rituals she performed were not madness, but messages, coded warnings to courtiers who learned to fear the smallest gesture from her hand. The palace chroniclers tried to soften these stories, but the fragments that survived reveal something far more unsettling. She did not just want obedience. She wanted to dismantle the very idea that resistance was possible. And that brings us to the turning point, the moment when she crossed the invisible threshold between ruler and legend. But before we reach that, let me ask you something. Have you ever wondered how far someone will go once they believe mercy is a weakness? You might be surprised how much of her story echoes the psychology of modern power. If this beginning has already stirred something in you, if you feel the weight of what we are uncovering, tell me your thoughts. Your comment becomes part of this journey. And while you are here, make sure to like this video and check whether you are subscribed, because understanding what shaped this queen is only the first step. The next part leads us deeper into the world that created her, and the path ahead grows darker as we follow it. Her rise was not a sudden explosion of brutality, but a careful layering of strategy, survival instinct, and a deep understanding of how humans behave when confronted with uncertainty. The young queen quickly realized that people fear the unknown far more than the visible blade. So she began constructing an aura of unpredictability around herself, letting rumors grow unchecked. Some said she never slept. Others claimed she drew omens from the way candles melted or from patterns of ash left after sacrifices. Whether any of this was true mattered far less than the effect it created. Her enemies hesitated. Her allies tiptoed, and hesitation for her was as valuable as loyal soldiers. But before she fully embraced terror as a tool, she attempted something different: understanding. She observed the court from behind veils, watching which noble flinched. During political tension, which advisor folded under scrutiny, which general responded to pressure with aggression or fear. She treated these reactions like a map, each personality a terrain she could exploit. What fascinated her most was how fragile the powerful truly were when stripped of ceremony. She saw cracks everywhere, fractures that only needed a little pressure to split wide open, and she learned to apply that pressure in ways that left no trace, making her influence appear supernatural. Her transformation accelerated when an assassination attempt nearly succeeded. The attack was small, almost sloppy, likely launched by desperate conspirators who underestimated her reach. But to her, it was revelation. It was proof that mercy was a luxury she could no longer afford, that survivors of the old order would never stop testing her. Instead of retreating, she turned the incident into a silent trial of everyone around her. Who looked away too quickly? Who offered condolences with too much enthusiasm? Who seemed relieved she was still alive? Each reaction told her more than any interrogation could. From that moment on, she began crafting a new persona. She distanced herself from familiar routines, changed her advisors, altered ceremonies, and even redesigned the private chambers where only a handful of trusted attendants were allowed to enter. The palace's heartbeat changed. Soldiers patrolling the corridors walked with quieter steps. Servants whispered, more than they spoke. Even the nobles who once plotted openly now feared that any word uttered in confidence might reach her ears through channels they did not understand. Yet what truly set her apart was not just the fear she commanded, but the precision with which she used it. She never punished randomly. She punished symbolically. Each disappearance, each exile, each sudden transfer of power served a purpose that only she fully understood. She was not simply eliminating threats. She was rewriting the emotional architecture of her kingdom. She molded the court into a place where people feared not only crossing her, but even failing to interpret her intentions correctly. And while many rulers created fear through spectacle, she created something far more enduring: anticipation. People lived not in terror of what she had done, but of what she might do next. That uncertainty became her most powerful weapon. It spread across the kingdom like a fog, settling into every rumor, every ritual, every political maneuver until no one could distinguish truth from myth. And in that blur of shadows and stories, her authority solidified. But the shift that came next was more profound than anything she had done so far, because it marked the moment when she stopped playing defense and began reshaping the very foundations of power itself. A shift that would redefine her legacy in ways no chronicler could fully capture. What followed was the construction of a system so meticulously engineered that it blended political control with psychological domination. She understood better than any ruler before her that a kingdom is not secured merely by soldiers or wealth, but by shaping what people believe is possible. So she began building a structure of power that operated on multiple layers, some visible, others intentionally veiled. Advisors thought they understood her decisions. Generals believed they carried out her strategies. Courtiers convinced themselves they could anticipate her moods. Yet all of them were navigating illusions she had intentionally crafted to keep them guessing. The first pillar of her system was information. She reorganized her network of messengers, spies, and informants into something almost organic. A living organism that fed her every whisper traveling through the kingdom. Unlike other rulers who relied on brute force, she learned to weaponize secrets. A rumor of disloyalty would not lead to immediate punishment. Instead, she would grant favors to the suspected traitor, raise their position, force them into the spotlight, and watch how their associates reacted. This created patterns of tension so subtle that people often incriminated themselves without realizing it. The second pillar was ritual. Not necessarily religious, though the sacred played its part, but symbolic rituals that cultivated obedience through shared belief. She held audiences in unpredictable locations, sometimes in candle-lit halls, sometimes in outdoor courtyards at dawn, sometimes in rooms so silent that even the rustling of clothing felt intrusive. These choices were not aesthetic. They were psychological conditioning. She wanted each person who spoke to her to feel unbalanced, unsure of how to present themselves, always slightly off-center. In that emotional instability, she found leverage. Her third pillar was ambiguity. She issued decrees that were intentionally open to interpretation, allowing factions to argue over meaning while she watched in silence. Disputes over her policies consumed the energy of her rivals, leaving them too exhausted to unite against her. The brilliance lay in how she enforced these decrees. She never clarified them herself. Instead, punishment came only when someone acted with too much certainty. This taught the entire kingdom a dangerous lesson. Caution was survival. Initiative was risk. But the fourth pillar was the most unsettling. She introduced a system of selective terror designed not to punish, but to create psychological echoes. When someone fell out of favor, the consequences unfolded slowly, almost ceremonially. Privileges were revoked one by one, allies grew distant, rumors multiplied. By the time punishment arrived, often quietly and without spectacle, the victim had already been destroyed socially and emotionally. Their fate served as a silent message to anyone considering disobedience. The genius of this method was that it allowed her to maintain the appearance of stability while cultivating an environment of constant vigilance. This system transformed the palace into a labyrinth, every corridor a test of loyalty, every conversation a strategic move. People no longer thought about their ambitions. They thought about their survival. And in that shift, she found the absolute control she had been building toward since the moment she first recognized the fragility of power. Yet even this was only preparation. The true transformation of her reign emerged when she combined these silent mechanisms with something far older and far darker, a series of hidden practices that blurred the line between political theater and personal ritual. These were the acts that would confound historians, terrify her enemies, and seal her reputation as the most ruthless queen who ever lived. By the time she began implementing her most secretive practices, the court had already become a mirror of her mind, layered, unpredictable, and quietly terrifying. She understood that fear alone could not maintain absolute authority. It had to be reinforced by ritual and symbolism. Hidden chambers were repurposed, corridors mapped like traps, and servants trained to observe, remember, and report. Every corner of the palace became a stage where perception mattered as much as reality. Even a whisper could be weaponized, a glance could be interpreted, and the uncertainty itself became a tool of governance. People began to understand that the queen's power was not only in her commands, but in the invisible threads she wove through every interaction, every decision, every gesture. It was here that the darker elements of her reign took shape. She commissioned ceremonies shrouded in secrecy, where symbolism merged with psychological strategy. Nobles who questioned her subtly were invited to participate in rituals that seemed benign, but were designed to expose their allegiances. A misplaced word, a hesitation, a glance exchanged in the wrong context could reveal loyalties, intentions, even hidden fears. And those who failed these tests were quietly removed, not always through execution, but through exile, loss of favor, or carefully orchestrated social isolation. Their names faded from public memory, their influence extinguished, leaving the court increasingly dependent on her presence and approval. Even more disturbing were the private rituals she orchestrated within the inner chambers of the palace, away from public eyes. Courtiers spoke in hushed tones of midnight gatherings where the queen enacted lessons of obedience and hierarchy, using both fear and fascination. These were not acts of cruelty for spectacle alone. They were meticulously calculated psychological exercises. She drew from ancient traditions, superstition, and her own insight into human behavior to create a system in which devotion was intertwined with terror, and every participant became an instrument of her will. By mastering the minds of those closest to her, she ensured that every faction within the kingdom was subtly aligned with her interests, even when they believed they were acting independently. The queen's strategies were as much about observation as they were about action. She rarely needed to enforce her will directly. Her presence alone inspired vigilance. The courtiers began internalizing her expectations, preemptively correcting behavior to avoid subtle punishments or social embarrassment. Her reputation spread beyond the palace walls. Nobles in distant provinces would hesitate, unsure whether an innocuous decision might one day incur her scrutiny. Fear became decentralized, self-perpetuating. It was a quiet, omnipresent control, far more effective than any army could achieve. Every citizen, every noble, every soldier learned to measure themselves against the unseen standards of her tyranny. And yet, for all this methodical cruelty, she understood the importance of narrative. Stories of punishment, rumors of hidden ceremonies, and the occasional revelation of a disloyal courtier's fate circulated in a controlled manner, shaping perception without exposing the mechanics of her power. People feared not only what they saw, but what they imagined. That uncertainty became a crucible that solidified her dominion, forging obedience from both respect and dread. Now, I want to ask you, can you imagine living in a palace where every word, every gesture, every glance could determine your fate? How would it feel to exist under such a calculated, invisible authority? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Describe what strikes you most about her methods and what it would mean to witness such control firsthand. Your insights add to this exploration, and every comment helps illuminate the human dimension behind the legend of the most ruthless queen who ever lived. As her reign progressed, the queen's methods evolved from subtle manipulation to overt demonstrations of power that left no room for doubt. Her punishments were not random acts of cruelty. They were highly orchestrated displays designed to convey lessons of loyalty, obedience, and consequence. The court had learned that her patience was infinite, but her tolerance was measured in precision. A single act of disobedience, no matter how minor, could be transformed into a narrative of warning, executed with both theatrical flair and clinical calculation. Those who witnessed her decisions understood immediately. She controlled not just their actions, but their perception of reality itself. She took particular care in how punishments were enacted. Public exposure was a weapon, but she preferred psychological theater over bloodshed when possible. A general stripped of command would parade through the halls, aware that every eye assessed him for weakness. A noblewoman suspected of plotting might be invited to a formal ceremony, where subtle slights and public corrections were woven into an elaborate pattern of humiliation. Each act reinforced the hierarchy she commanded, ensuring that fear and reverence coexisted, intertwined in a delicate equilibrium that maintained her supremacy. The precision with which she executed these measures created a climate where speculation was as potent as action and where obedience became instinctive rather than coerced. But the queen's brutality was not confined to symbolic gestures. She recognized that power often required enforcing boundaries physically, when necessary, to deter threats before they grew. Strategically timed removals, sudden transfers, and carefully orchestrated exile served a dual purpose. They eliminated opposition while broadcasting her capacity to act decisively. These moves were rarely announced beforehand. Anticipation alone worked as a tool of control. People lived in a constant state of calculated anxiety, understanding that the unseen mechanisms of her authority could strike without warning. Her reputation spread beyond the palace, into the provinces, among generals, and throughout the nobility, where even a whispered rumor of her displeasure could shift alliances and alter decisions. In the military sphere, her influence extended as far as her understanding of psychological leverage allowed. Soldiers and commanders alike learned that her favor could secure promotion or prosperity, while misjudging her expectations could lead to disgrace or forced reassignment. This subtle control ensured loyalty not through overt intimidation, alone, but by shaping ambition itself. Officers recalibrated strategies based on anticipation of her approval. Generals reconsidered the timing of campaigns to avoid unseen censure. Even the strongest and most independent figures in her command structure had to account for the Queen's presence as if it were a tangible force shaping their every move. Yet even as her authority grew, the Queen never allowed herself to be seen as invincible. She cultivated an aura of unpredictability that kept everyone uncertain of her next move. Some nights, she appeared in public ceremonies with elaborate grandeur. Other nights, she vanished from sight entirely, only to re-emerge in moments that reasserted her control. The court learned that power in her hands was not linear or predictable. It was fluid, like water shaping its path through stone, capable of eroding resistance without leaving the source visible. By the time the people began to truly grasp her reach, her dominion had become total, not just over territory, but over perception, behavior, and even thought. Her court became a theater of shadows, each act meticulously designed to reinforce her omnipotence while keeping her adversaries uncertain of what might come next. Even the most seasoned advisors found themselves navigating invisible boundaries, deciphering subtle gestures and the cadence of her words for clues. No longer was survival determined solely by competence or loyalty. It depended on reading the unspoken language she controlled with precision. Every meeting, every announcement, every seemingly casual decision carried layers of meaning, each one calculated to instill awareness of her authority and the precariousness of opposition. Beyond the corridors of power, her influence reached into the personal lives of those around her. Families learned that alliances were fragile, friendships conditional, and trust a dangerous commodity. Courtiers who once believed themselves safe discovered that intimacy or favoritism could become instruments of exposure. A misplaced smile, a whispered opinion, a fleeting expression of disagreement, all were catalogued, interpreted, and repurposed to maintain her psychological dominance. Her understanding of human behavior extended into the minutiae of interaction, allowing her to manipulate even the most mundane social exchanges to her advantage. Fear was not only a tool, it was a constant, invisible companion for everyone who operated within her orbit. The Queen's military strategies reflected the same mastery of subtle coercion. She rarely relied on brute force alone, instead creating systems of surveillance, controlled information flow, and preemptive manipulation that often neutralized threats before they materialized. Generals found that obedience stemmed not from the sword, but from the anticipation of her scrutiny and the nuanced consequences of misjudgment. Even allies became instruments of her will, acting in ways that reinforced her supremacy, while believing themselves autonomous. Her ability to harness human ambition, fear, and expectation became a force multiplier, extending her influence far beyond the palace walls and into every province under her rule. Her most loyal servants were not necessarily the bravest or most skilled, but those who could adapt to the unpredictable rhythm of her judgment. Training, ceremony, and ritual became methods for conditioning the court, not merely instruments of pageantry. They learned to internalize her standards and to anticipate her reaction to every decision, every failure, every misstep. Through this relentless psychological conditioning, she ensured that obedience was automatic, that even without her direct involvement, the mechanisms of power she built continued to operate seamlessly. It was a system that blurred the line between voluntary compliance and instinctive survival, making resistance almost unimaginable. Yet for all her control, she understood the importance of calculated discretion. She revealed her power selectively, letting rumors and partial truths circulate to create an aura of omniscience. Stories of punishment, exile, or public shaming were strategically dispersed, magnifying fear while preserving mystery. By controlling perception, she amplified her authority without expending resources unnecessarily. In the palace and across the kingdom, her shadow was everywhere, felt, discussed, feared, but rarely seen in its entirety. This mastery of psychological warfare, hidden beneath the trappings of ceremony and governance, became the defining feature of her reign and the cornerstone of her reputation as the most ruthless queen who ever lived. Her mastery of power extended into warfare, where she applied the same principles of psychological domination that governed her court to entire armies. Unlike other rulers who relied solely on brute strength, she orchestrated campaigns that manipulated fear, anticipation, and perception before any weapon was drawn. Scouts and spies carried back fragments of information that she allowed to filter selectively, creating confusion in enemy ranks. The threat she posed was not just in the size of her forces or the skill of her generals, but in the uncertainty she instilled, an intangible yet paralyzing force that weakened resistance before battle even began. Her enemies learned that the most dangerous attacks were not always the ones they could see, but the ones they feared could happen at any moment. Even within her own armies, she maintained absolute control through psychological strategy. Soldiers were trained to internalize her expectations, to anticipate consequences for failure, and to witness the fates of those who faltered as a warning. She understood that fear could unify as effectively as loyalty, and she used it to ensure cohesion, obedience, and precision in execution. But unlike a simple tyrant, she blended this fear with opportunity. Those who excelled, who interpreted her intentions correctly, or who acted with initiative within the bounds of her unspoken rules were rewarded in ways that reinforced her authority. The duality of terror and reward created a culture where survival and success were inseparable from her favor, shaping the behavior of men who had once considered themselves independent actors. The queen also demonstrated an uncanny understanding of human nature in larger conflicts. When facing rebellions or hostile powers, she rarely attacked directly at first. Instead, she sowed doubt, spread misinformation, and allowed rumors of her strategies to reach enemy ears. This tactic forced opponents to make decisions under uncertainty, often leading them to errors that she could exploit. Even the most confident generals second-guessed themselves, unsure whether what they heard was truth or manipulation. By the time her armies engaged in actual combat, many had already been destabilized, their morale weakened, and their planning compromised. Her victories were therefore as much psychological as they were military, a testament to her unparalleled ruthlessness. But it was her understanding of perception that truly elevated her reputation. Tales of her cruelty, of punishments for disloyalty, of secret trials and executions, spread deliberately through court whispers and selective leaks. These stories created an environment where her enemies feared the unknown more than any tangible threat. Allegiances shifted before orders were given. Plans unraveled under imagined scrutiny. Rivalries dissolved in anticipation of her judgment. The queen became not only a ruler, but a symbol of omnipresent authority. Her influence felt in every whisper, every glance, and every calculated hesitation. Now I want to ask you, how would it feel to witness such absolute control over life, loyalty, and fear? Could you endure living in a world where every action is measured against the standards of someone who manipulates reality itself? Leave a comment below and share your thoughts on what strikes you most about her strategies. Your insights bring this history to life and help illuminate the mechanisms behind her ruthless rule. Don't hold back. Reflect on what it would be like to live under the shadow of the most calculating queen in history. Even as her court and military thrived under the architecture of fear, the queen's control extended into the farthest corners of her kingdom. Governors, provincial nobles, and local officials quickly learned that independence was an illusion. Every decree, every action, every decision they made was subject to scrutiny, sometimes immediate, often subtle, always measured. She had created a culture of preemptive obedience. People began correcting their behavior in anticipation of her judgment, internalizing the rules of power before they were even stated. This psychological conditioning became as effective as any army, extending her influence into territories she never physically visited. Her reputation for ruthless efficiency spread faster than her armies could march. Stories of her decisive punishments and the mysterious disappearances of those who crossed her became part of local folklore, leaving even distant subjects in a state of anxious respect. Rebellions, once the lifeblood of ambitious nobles seeking to exploit perceived weakness, were crushed before they fully formed. Her agents, trained to observe and interpret behavior as though reading a living map of human intention, intercepted plans, dismantled conspiracies, and neutralized threats before anyone could rally forces. It was a preemptive tyranny, one that worked through the anticipation of consequences rather than through immediate violence. But it was in her response to conspiracies and uprisings that her genius in fear manipulation became undeniable. When a rebellion emerged, often sparked by miscalculation or overconfidence among local leaders, she rarely acted directly at first. Instead, she let uncertainty permeate, allowing paranoia to spread among the insurgents. Every delay, every ambiguous signal from the palace, increased anxiety, eroded trust within the ranks, and destabilized the initiative of those plotting against her. By the time she made her move, she faced disorganized, demoralized opponents, defeated before the battle even began. Her power was not measured in the size of her armies, but in her capacity to control perception, manipulating the enemy's mind. To the same degree, she controlled her own court. Her campaigns against rebellion were as calculated as her governance. Provinces suspected of disloyalty were subjected to ritualized inspections, not only to assess military readiness, but to gauge the psychological state of officials. Subtle tests, a delayed reply to a message, an invitation to a seemingly ceremonial event, or a routine request for attendance at court, served as instruments for measuring compliance, loyalty, and fear. Those who faltered were quietly removed from positions of influence, sometimes reassigned, sometimes exiled, their absence amplifying uncertainty for others. In this way, she extended her reach across her realm without overt displays of force, her authority operating invisibly yet undeniably in every corner. By merging psychological warfare with governance, she created a system where power radiated from the throne like a gravitational force, pulling both allies and enemies into alignment with her will. Provinces became self-regulating under her influence, guided by a combination of fear, anticipation, and the careful manipulation of perception. Even when she did not intervene personally, her presence was felt in every strategic decision, every political negotiation, and every calculation of risk. Her legend grew not because of spectacles of blood, but because the uncertainty of her judgment alone reshaped behavior, ensuring that her dominion was unchallenged, pervasive, and enduring. The Chopper Queen's influence did not stop at manipulation of courts or armies. It extended into the very fabric of daily life throughout her realm. Citizens, merchants, and minor officials learned quickly that the ripple of her authority reached farther than any messenger could travel. Even rumors carried weight, serving as instruments to align behavior, suppress dissent, and enforce compliance. By instilling a culture where perception mattered as much as fact, she made it impossible for anyone to act independently without considering the potential consequences in the shadow of her throne. People began policing themselves, internalizing a set of rules that were never fully explained, but were enforced through subtle observation, rumor, and occasional decisive interventions. Her mastery of psychological control allowed her to manipulate the ambitions of her allies just as skillfully as the fears of her enemies. Promises of favor and promotion were carefully calibrated, offered to those whose loyalty was strong and withdrawn from those whose reliability was uncertain. But even rewards became tools of control, binding recipients to her will with gratitude, obligation, and the subtle terror of knowing they were constantly evaluated. Every accolade, every advancement, was not merely a gift, but a measured step in the architecture of her supremacy. Those who thrived under her favor learned that excellence was inseparable from vigilance and attentiveness to her signals, whether explicit or implied. At the provincial level, she created a system that relied as much on psychological leverage as on administrative authority. Governors and local leaders quickly understood that compliance was not enough. Anticipation of her desires and the avoidance of perceived slights became essential. She deployed observers to collect subtle details from daily interactions, allowing her to act against threats before they fully developed. Even minor incidents, a hesitant reply, a slightly delayed report, a misinterpreted gesture, could be used to justify intervention, reinforcing the idea that her reach was both omnipresent and inescapable. By the time a complaint reached her attention, the underlying issue had often already destabilized itself, leaving her in a position of absolute authority without overt action. Her strategies extended to shaping public perception across her kingdom. Stories of previous rebellions, subtle punishments, or the mysterious disappearance of courtiers circulated intentionally, fostering a climate of uncertainty. Citizens learned to live with a constant awareness of the potential consequences of disloyalty, and even the wealthiest and most powerful nobles adjusted their behavior to align with her expectations. Fear and respect became inseparable. Obedience was internalized, almost instinctive. By controlling not only actions, but thought, she ensured that even those who plotted against her were bound by the invisible architecture of her dominance. And yet, the Queen's most lasting impact was not only in the control she exercised during her life, but in the perception she created for generations to come. Her ability to integrate psychology, ritual, and strategy forged a legacy that endured beyond her physical presence, inspiring both awe and terror in historians, chroniclers, and descendants alike. Every measure, every calculated decision, every subtle manipulation contributed to a system where the Queen's influence became as inescapable as gravity, felt in every glance, every whisper, every careful movement of those living under her rule. In this way, her reign was not simply a period of power, but a masterclass in control, shaping behavior, loyalty, and fear across an entire kingdom in ways that would echo long after her time. As the final years of her reign unfolded, the Queen's influence reached a culmination that few could fully comprehend. Her strategies, painstakingly developed over decades, had created a kingdom where loyalty, fear, and ambition were inseparable threads in a complex tapestry. By the time she faced the challenges of her later years, internal dissent, foreign threats, and the inevitable decay of time itself, she had already shaped the psychological landscape of her domain in ways that guaranteed her authority would persist long after her life ended. Her name became synonymous with power, her methods studied and whispered about, and her legacy carved into the annals of history as both a warning and a marvel. Even in her final days, she maintained the careful balance of uncertainty and spectacle that had defined her rule. Courtiers and generals never fully knew which decisions would provoke her scrutiny or which actions might inadvertently secure her favor. The rituals, the selective punishments, the invisible webs of control. These continued to operate seamlessly, ensuring that the machinery of power she had built remained intact. Every story, every rumor, every calculated act had prepared the kingdom for a transition that would cement her image as the most ruthless queen who ever lived. Historians would later debate which tales were fact and which were legend, but the effect on those who lived through her reign was immediate and undeniable. Obedience, fear, and admiration became almost indistinguishable. Her final acts, whether in political maneuvering or symbolic gesture, demonstrated a mastery of timing that few rulers have ever achieved. She knew when to intervene, when to let uncertainty govern, and when to let consequences unfold without her direct hand. Even death could not fully diminish her control. The mechanisms of influence she had designed persisted, carried forward by the very people she had trained to anticipate, adapt, and enforce her will. The echoes of her reign resonated in every decision, every alliance, and every fear-driven choice long after she was gone. Her kingdom had internalized her authority so completely that her presence remained, invisible yet tangible, shaping behavior and expectation for generations. And now, as we reflect on her life and legacy, consider this. What can we learn from the strategies of someone who wielded fear, loyalty, and psychological mastery with such precision? How does the understanding of her methods reveal the interplay between human ambition and the structures of power? If you have followed her story to this point, take a moment to think about the subtle ways authority can influence, manipulate, and endure beyond its visible form. Share your thoughts in the comments below with a phrase like, "I stayed until the end," or "This lesson resonates with me." Let us know which part of her strategies struck you most, which moment surprised you, or what insight you take from her reign. While you're reflecting, don't forget to like this video and check if you're subscribed so you can continue exploring stories that reveal the hidden mechanics of history, power, and influence. And finally, if you're curious to see more, there is another video waiting that complements this exploration. Click over and continue with me. You'll see how the legacies of power, fear, and strategy echo in ways you never imagined.